Charlie! Lola? Charlie! Charlie and Lola! I will not ever, never forget you, Nibbles. I have this little sister Lola. She is small and very funny. Meow. Not a cat, no. Oh, is it a rabbit? Mm-mm. Today Lola is excited. No. Nope. Because Mum and Dad say I'm allowed to have a pet. Please tell me, Charlie. What is it going to be? Give me a tiny weeny help. Look at him. Ooh. Oh. What are you going to call your mouse, Charlie? Mouse? Nibbles. Hello, Nibbles. Can I hold him? Not yet, Lola. The man in the shop said we have to let him get used to us and to his new home. Slowly. Look, Lola. Isn't he sweet? Oh, look at him. Oh, he's very soft. Can I hold him? I'll be very careful. Okay. Ooh. But the pet shop man said you have to wash your hands afterwards. Okay, I will. I just want to hold him for a bit more longer. Come on, here's the food. There you go, Nibbles. You are a very clever mouse. I bet Nibbles can do even more clever things. Make him go up my arm too. He really is extremely clever, Charlie. Tomorrow is our Bring a Pet to School day. Marv's bringing Sizzles and I'm going to bring Nibbles. Come on, Nibbles. Oh, Nibbles will definitely be the cleverest pet in the whole school. Go on, Nibbles, along the top of the rope. Come on. Go to Lola. Stick insects. Stick insects are really good pets because you have to be really careful how you hold them. If you drop them by accident, their legs fall off. And then they're just sticks. But they do grow back again. Ooh, thank you. My dog Sizzles is a sausage dog, also called a dachshund. And I've taught him all sorts of things, like sit. Sit. Will you sit down? Mice. Mice are really clever. They have tails which are the same length as their bodies. They belong to the family of animals which is called rodents. They don't use their whiskers. Look, Lotta! Nibbles' nose is going all twitchy. Oh, does that mean he's happy? Yes, happy. So I'm going to ask my little sister Lola to come up and help me. Yes. To show you how clever my mouse Nibbles is. Go. Nibbles. Nibbles. There you are, Nibbles. Nibbles. Come on. You can do it. Go to Lola. Yes. Nibbles did it. Well done, Nibbles. When Nibbles is older and bigger, he might be able to do all kinds of tricks. Millions and 100 of people come to see Nibbles the Daredevil Mouse. The first ever mouse to cross a waterfall on a tightrope. Come on, Nibbles! Be careful, Nibbles! Oh, I can't walk! Ooh. Be careful, Nibbles! 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 Ooh. have to be much bigger to do that trick, won't he, Charlie?
Yep.
Sleep tight, Nibbles.
Hello, Nibbles. Nibbles, where are you?
Where are you?
There you are.
Oh, Nibbles, don't eat that. That's Charlie's present. Most of all, you like being stroked, don't you?
But then one day...
Isn't Nibbles awake yet?
No, Lola.
Sleepy Nibbles. Do you think he will wake up if I go and get his favourite mouse food?
No, I don't think so.
Why not, Charlie?
Because I think Nibbles has died.
Oh, I don't think so, Charlie. He's just tired and just very not moving, like a statue.
I'm afraid, Lola, Nibbles is definitely not going to wake up.
You're just not seeing properly, Charlie. Oh. Nibbles is completely not moving, Charlie.
I know. Mum said we can use this box to bury Nibbles in.
Why do we have to bury him?
It's what you do when your mouse dies. The ancient Egyptians used to make a sarcophagus.
What is a sarcophagus?
It's a kind of special box that they decorated and put treasure in.
For mice?
No, for when one of the ancient Egypt people died. But I think it would be nice to make one for Nibbles.
Ooh.
Because he was really special. So we decorated a special box for Nibbles.
Nibbles loved glitter. Oh, and leaves. He loved leaves.
And we put all of Nibbles' favourite things into his box.
And this was his favourite.
Hey, that's my sock.
That was Nibbles' favourite, his sock.
Mum wrapped Nibbles in a handkerchief and Dad dug a little hole in the garden in a really nice place by the tree. And then we had to say goodbye to Nibbles. Nibbles, you were a very clever mouse. And I didn't really mind you nibbling everything.
I will never forget you, Nibbles.
Mum says maybe pink milk will cheer you up, Lola. I'm going to play downstairs with Marv. Do you want to come?
No.
I miss Nibbles too. Mice don't always live for a very long time, Lola.
Why not?
That's just the way it is.
Hmm.
Do you remember that time when Nibbles tried to help you do your painting?
Nibbles! Good painting. Nibbles was quite naughty sometimes.
Are you sure you don't want to come down to Marv's?
Okay.
You could play with my mouse Squeak if you like. Maybe we can get another mouse, Lola.
No, Charlie. I like mouses, but I will be very extremely upset in case the next mouse dies too.
All mice die, Lola, because you see, they don't live for very long.
That's what Charlie said. Huh? Charlie, did you see what Squeak did? He jumped all the way from here to all the way over here.
That's his favourite trick. Nibbles never did jumping, did he, Lola? All mice are different. That's why they make such good pets.
Maybe, perhaps, we should get another mouse after all. You know Nibbles was really good at the skipping rope, Charlie. Well, watch this. Go on. Go on.
What have you called him?
Pickles! I'm going to go.